If you grew up poor in the 1970s, you knew the feeling of opening the fridge and seeing just a carton of milk, a stick of margarine, and maybe a plate of yesterday's leftovers wrapped in foil. The shelves looked empty more often than full, but families still found a way to stretch those scraps into meals. Hunger wasn't always about going without food. It was about learning to make something out of almost nothing. Working-class families across America faced that quiet struggle. Wages were modest, prices crept up, and for many, there was no cushion when the week ran long. A trip to the grocery store wasn't casual. It was carefully planned. Mothers clipped coupons, circled sales in the newspaper, and counted every penny before stepping inside. Fathers sometimes brought home overtime pay, and when they didn't, cupboards stayed bare a little longer. Each grocery trip was a strategy, a battle of numbers and needs, played out under fluorescent lights and crowded aisles. Eating out simply wasn't an option for most families living paycheck to paycheck. Restaurants were a rare treat, reserved for birthdays or holidays, not an everyday escape. Dinner wasn't delivered to the front door. It was pulled together in a small kitchen, with the smell of onions frying in a pan or bread warming in the oven. Mothers and grandmothers became masters of improvisation, turning basic staples into stews, casseroles, and soups that could feed many mouths. For the children, though, the picture looked different. Most didn't know they were poor until they grew older and compared their lives to others. To them, sitting around the kitchen table with chipped plates and mismatched cups was just normal. A slice of white bread folded over a piece of bologna felt like a feast. Drinking Kool-Aid from a plastic pitcher was just part of being a kid. They weren't counting dollars. They were counting the moments of family togetherness, even if the meals were humble. The memories that linger aren't only about the lack. They're about the sound of a mother humming as she stirred a pot of beans, or the way a father bowed his head in thanks before a simple supper. They're about kids running in from play, cheeks red from the sun, only to find peanut butter spread thinly on bread waiting on the counter. In hindsight, the food might not have been much, but the feeling of home was priceless. And yet, behind the warmth of those memories was always the quiet tension of scarcity. Parents carried the worry silently, hoping the paycheck stretched far enough, praying the car wouldn't break down, or that shoes could last another season. Food was more than sustenance. It was survival, identity, and memory all rolled into one. But when payday finally came, the grocery store told the real story of poverty and creativity. It looked like milk, poured like milk, but it never quite fooled anyone. Powdered milk was the poor family's secret in the 1970s, though not much of a secret to the kids who had to drink it. It came in big cardboard boxes or oversized pouches, promising gallons of fresh milk once mixed with water. The promise rarely matched reality. The taste was thin, chalky, and left a strange afterbite that made kids wrinkle their noses. But for families trying to make a dollar stretch, it was a lifeline. Fresh milk was a luxury when budgets were tight. The glass bottles and half-gallon cartons stacked in store coolers looked tempting, but the price difference was hard to ignore. For a fraction of the cost, powdered milk provided the same calcium, the same utility, and a lot more staying power in the pantry. It didn't spoil after a few days. It didn't need refrigeration until it was mixed. For a parent counting coins at the checkout line, that mattered more than flavor. Many mothers learned tricks to soften the disappointment. Some would mix half real milk with half powdered, hoping the fresher taste would disguise the compromise. Others poured it straight into baked goods or pancake batter, where no one could complain. But at the breakfast table, poured over cereal, the difference was clear. Kids stirred extra sugar into their bowls, or let the flakes get soggy just to mask the strange taste. Complaints filled kitchens across the country, but so did empty cups because powdered milk, like it or not, kept children fed. The memory of it sticks, maybe because it was more than just a drink. It was a symbol of doing without, of parents choosing necessity over comfort. For many families, it became a silent reminder that money was tight. Yet there was also a kind of resilience in those boxes. They proved that life could go on even when choices were limited. They turned scarcity into survival. Looking back, some recall powdered milk with a smile, joking about how no amount of sugar or chocolate syrup could ever save it. Others remember it less fondly, as the taste that haunted their childhood breakfasts. But either way, it tells a story of families that found a way forward when fresh milk wasn't in reach. And right next to the powdered milk, another survival staple sat on the shelf: canned meat. It wasn't steak, but it filled a plate. For families on a tight budget in the 1970s, cans of Spam or Vienna sausages were the poor man's protein. Sitting on pantry shelves for months without spoiling, these salty staples were there when fresh cuts of meat were out of reach. They weren't glamorous, but they were cheap, easy to prepare, and versatile enough to find their way into breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Spam, with its pink block of pressed meat, became both a punchline and a necessity. Sliced thin and fried in the skillet, it gave off a sizzling aroma that made the kitchen feel richer than it was. Laid between two slices of white bread with a smear of mustard, it became a hearty sandwich that could carry a child through the school day. Cubed and tossed into casseroles, it stretched a meal just far enough to feed a family of 6. In some homes, it was paired with eggs on a Saturday morning, transforming what could have been a bare-bones breakfast into something that felt indulgent. Vienna sausages had their own reputation. Packed in little cans filled with brine, they slid out in pale, soft links that kids either loved or hated. Some ate them cold straight from the tin. Others insisted they had to be browned in a pan to be edible. Their odd texture and faintly smoky taste made them memorable, and their small size made them perfect for stretching into dishes like rice casseroles or simple stews. They were never confused with fine dining, but for children growing up in lean households, they were a treat that meant protein was on the table. These meats carried another advantage. Unlike fresh chicken or pork chops, which spoiled quickly if not eaten, Spam and Vienna sausages sat patiently on pantry shelves, waiting for the next stretch of lean days. They were insurance policies in metal cans, reminders that no matter how thin the paycheck, there would always be something to fry, slice, or stir into a pot. Their affordability gave them staying power. For the price of one cut of steak, a family could buy multiple cans of Spam, enough to spread across several meals. The economics made sense, even if the taste didn't always satisfy. Over time, they became cultural icons of poverty food, remembered with equal parts laughter and groans. For many, just the sound of a can being opened brings back the memory of crowded kitchens, hungry children, and the resourcefulness of parents who made the best of what they had. But not every meal had meat. Often, dinner was built around one humble, filling staple. They were cheap, they were filling, and they showed up on the dinner table almost every night. Beans, in all their shapes and colors, were the backbone of poor families' diets in the 1970s. Pinto beans, navy beans, black beans, kidney beans, each one carried its own flavor, but they all shared the same purpose: to stretch a meal as far as it could possibly go. Most often, families bought them dry, in big bags that weighed down the bottom of the grocery cart. Canned beans were convenient, but they cost more, and for a household counting pennies, that extra expense wasn't worth it. So the ritual began the night before. Beans were poured into a pot, covered with water, and left to soak. Mothers checked the pot in the morning, rinsed the beans, and set them to simmer for hours. The slow bubbling filled kitchens with a smell that was earthy and comforting, a signal that dinner would be ready by evening. What beans lacked in glamour, they made up for in flexibility. They could be seasoned with a ham bone, a slice of bacon, or just a sprinkle of salt and pepper. When meat wasn't available, beans stood on their own, ladled into bowls beside cornbread, spooned over rice, or served with boiled potatoes. No matter the pairing, They left stomachs full at a fraction of the cost of meat. For parents, that was what mattered most. Beans also carried tradition. Recipes weren't written down so much as passed along, learned by watching a grandmother stir the pot, or by tasting how much spice to add until it felt just right. In some families, a pot of red beans and rice wasn't just a meal. It was a ritual, tying generations together through the simple act of cooking what was available. Even in the tightest times, beans could make a house smell like home. For children, beans could feel repetitive, even boring, when they showed up night after night. Yet looking back, many remember them fondly: the texture, the aroma, the way cornbread crumbled into the broth. What once seemed like monotony now feels like comfort, proof that food didn't have to be fancy to leave a mark. Today, beans still carry that legacy. They're embraced again by those who seek frugal cooking or a healthier lifestyle. But for those who grew up poor, they will always be a reminder of leaner days when the most important thing was simply having enough. They are survival food, cultural food, and comfort food all at once. Of course, beans went best with one thing every poor household kept: stocked bread. If you grew up poor, you can still remember the orange block thick, rubbery government cheese. It arrived in plain cardboard packaging, stamped simply with black letters. No brand name, no cartoon cow, no glossy advertising. Just a block of processed dairy handed out through USDA surplus programs, meant to help low-income families stretch their food supply. For many children in the 1970s, that cheese became more than food. It was a symbol of poverty, yes, but also of survival. It was dense, heavy, and stubborn in the pan. It didn't melt easily, no matter how high the heat. Sliced thin and laid between two pieces of bread, it resisted the transformation into gooey grilled cheese, often leaving a rubbery center with browned edges. Yet somehow, it is still satisfying. Parents made do, frying sandwiches in margarine, cutting them into triangles, and serving them alongside tomato soup. It was never quite what television commercials promised, but it filled stomachs and stretched budgets in ways that mattered. Macaroni and cheese, another childhood favorite, often carried that unmistakable flavor. The cheese didn't flow like the boxed versions with powdered packets, but it clung stubbornly to noodles, creating a dish that was hearty if not entirely smooth. Casseroles benefited from its bulk, the cheese binding potatoes, rice, and vegetables together into one filling meal. However imperfect, it gave poor families a way to add richness to otherwise plain food. And then there was the bread. White bread was cheap, soft, and ever-present. Brands like Wonder Bread and Sunbeam were household names, but store-brand loaves often came home when the money ran out. Thin slices stuck to the roof of a child's mouth, but they stretched meals further. A single loaf could provide toast for breakfast, sandwiches for lunch, and a side for dinner. Sometimes, dinner itself was just cheese on white bread with a swipe of mayonnaise. Children may not have known it then, but they were eating the taste that defined poverty cooking in America. There was a strange comfort in it. The smell of toasted bread, the warm square of cheese, the simple routine of it all became ingrained in memory. Looking back, many adults smile at the thought of government cheese, recalling both the frustration of its toughness and the gratitude of having something to eat at all. It carried the weight of embarrassment for some, but in hindsight, it also carried the warmth of family kitchens where parents quietly did their best. But sometimes, the cheapest groceries weren't the healthiest, and kids knew it best when it came to cereal. Forget Lucky Charms. Poor families in the 1970s poured cereal from a plain white box that just said cornflakes. No cartoon mascot, no bright colors, no magical marshmallows, just block letters and a bag of flakes that tasted more like cardboard than breakfast. For children watching commercials on Saturday morning, the difference was clear. On TV, kids were diving into bowls of sugary rainbows. At home, The only excitement came from guessing whether today's flakes would be stale. Generic cereals began showing up in early discount stores, their plain packaging a badge of affordability. Parents weren't swayed by jingles or smiling leprechauns. They were swayed by price tags. For half the cost of the name brands, they could buy a box big enough to last a week. And when every dollar counted, flavor became a secondary concern. Cereal wasn't supposed to be fun. It was supposed to be filling. Of course, children noticed. To make the bland flakes palatable, parents reached for the same solution: sugar. Big paper bags of granulated sugar were pantry staples in poor households, bought in bulk because they were cheap and useful for everything. A spoonful, or sometimes several, was dumped over cereal until the milk turned cloudy and sweet. The crunch of sugar crystals at the bottom of the bowl became the best part of breakfast, even if it left kids buzzing long before school. The longing for real cereal never went away. Children begged for Frosted Flakes, Cheerios, or Cap'n Crunch, pointing at commercials where smiling kids had bowls that seemed bigger and brighter than life. Sometimes, on payday or during a special sale, a box of the good stuff made it into the cart. On those rare mornings, breakfast felt like a holiday. But most of the time, it was back to the no-name flakes, the sugar bowl, and the knowledge that things were different in their house compared to wealthier kids down the street. Still, there was something unifying about it. Every sibling had their own method of making cereal tolerable. Some drowned it in sugar, some let it soak until soggy, and some gave up halfway through the bowl. Complaints filled the kitchen, but so did laughter, as children shared in the quiet reality that this was simply how things were. Looking back, those bowls of plain flakes carry a strange nostalgia. They represent mornings when families gathered before long school days, when the television hummed in the background, and when simplicity was just part of life. And when breakfast ended, another poor man's staple was waiting for the next meal: potatoes. Mashed, fried, baked, boiled potatoes kept families fed when money ran out. In the 1970s, a 10 or 20-pound sack of russets could be bought for just a few dollars. And for poor families, that sack was worth its weight in gold. Potatoes were dependable. They lasted weeks in a cool pantry. They could be cooked a dozen different ways. And no matter how tight the budget was, they could stretch a meal to feed everyone at the table. Mothers and fathers leaned on potatoes the way earlier generations had during the Depression. They went into soups and stews, thickening the broth and adding bulk when there wasn't enough meat to go around. A single pork chop or small piece of chicken could be diced and folded into a casserole, surrounded by layers of sliced potatoes, cheese, and onions, suddenly becoming a meal for six. In households that counted every dollar, potatoes were the great equalizer: hearty, filling, and endlessly adaptable. Dinner didn't always include meat, but potatoes made sure no one left the table hungry. Fried potatoes with eggs often served as the main course, especially at the end of the week when the fridge looked bare. Mashed potatoes appeared at almost every Sunday supper, while baked potatoes could stand alone with just a pat of margarine or a sprinkle of salt. Some kids grew up thinking shepherd's pie was a fancy dish, when in reality, it was just a clever way to disguise yesterday's leftovers beneath a golden crust of mashed potatoes. The best part was that children rarely complained. Unlike powdered milk or generic cereal, potatoes actually tasted good. Crispy fried potatoes sizzling in a skillet were a comfort food that transcended poverty. Whether served hot with ketchup or cold from the fridge the next day, they felt like a treat even when everyone knew they were the cheapest thing in the kitchen. Potatoes also carried a symbolic weight. They were survival food, the kind of staple that anchored households when times got rough. They were humble yet dependable, a reminder that even when money was tight, families could still gather around the table and share something warm and satisfying. Looking back, many people remember them not as a burden, but as the quiet hero of their diets, turning scarcity into something that felt abundant. But even with all the starch and carbs, kids still crave something sweet. A scoop of Kool-Aid, a cup of sugar, and suddenly you had a whole pitcher of happiness. For kids in the 1970s, that little packet of drink mix was more than just flavored water. It was childhood in a glass. At only a few cents apiece, parents could buy several colors and flavors, from cherry red that stained your lips to a grape purple that never quite washed out of the cup. With sugar mixed in sometimes more sugar than water, it turned into a sweet treat that felt like soda without the price tag. For poor families, Kool-Aid wasn't just a drink, it was an event. Kids would crowd around the kitchen counter, watching the powder swirl into the water like magic. Mothers often handed a child the long spoon and told them to stir, giving them the honor of making the Kool-Aid. It was simple, it was cheap, and it was one of the rare things kids didn't complain about. Every glass carried the same taste of summer, no matter how little money was in the house. And when it came to sweetness, nothing captured the imagination like penny candy. Even children from the poorest neighborhoods could scrape together a dime and head to the corner store. Behind glass jars and bins were treasures: pixie sticks, jawbreakers, licorice ropes, gumdrops. A single penny could buy something colorful, chewy, or fizzy, and for a few glorious minutes, kids felt rich. Some carried paper sacks home, proud of their tiny collections, while others ate the candy on the walk back, savoring each piece before it disappeared. These small joys meant more than just sugar rushes. They were moments of escape. For children who saw their parents struggle, penny candy offered a pocket-sized reminder that life could still be sweet. Families might not afford vacations, new clothes, or restaurant meals, but a shared pitcher of Kool-Aid or a handful of candy made them feel like they weren't missing out entirely. It was proof that even in hard times, happiness didn't always come with a big price tag. Looking back, many adults smile when they remember those simple pleasures. The red Kool-Aid mustaches, the sticky fingers from unwrapped candy, the thrill of choosing treats one coin at a time. These details belong to a childhood that wasn't defined only by scarcity, but by resourcefulness and joy. Because no matter how poor the cupboards looked, families still found ways to come together. Looking back, the meals were simple, but they weren't just food. They were family. A pot of beans simmering on the stove, a stack of white bread waiting on the counter, potatoes frying in a pan. These were the quiet rhythms of everyday life for poor families in the 1970s. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't trendy. But it kept people alive, and more than that, it gave them something to gather around. Poverty food carried a certain honesty. There were no secrets in a can of Spam or a block of government cheese. Everyone knew it was cheap. Everyone knew it was a way to stretch a dollar until the next payday. Yet, somehow, those humble meals became the backbone of family memories. Children didn't think of themselves as poor while dipping white bread into a bowl of beans or sipping on a glass of too sweet Kool-Aid. In those moments, they felt full, safe, and loved. Time has a way of softening the edges. What once felt like struggle now feels like nostalgia. The chalky taste of powdered milk, the rubbery slice of government cheese, the bland crunch of generic cereal memories that once carried shame now bring a smile. They remind people of crowded kitchens, of laughter echoing through cramped houses, of parents doing everything they could to make ends meet. Poverty food may not have been anyone's dream, but it built strong generations who learned the meaning of resilience. These foods were more than calories. They were lessons. They taught families how to stretch, how to share, how to make something out of almost nothing. They showed children that survival wasn't just about having enough, but about sticking together when times were lean. Today, when someone opens a can of Vienna sausages or pours a glass of Kool-Aid for fun, it's not just nostalgia, it's a connection to the past, a quiet reminder of where they came from. In the end, poor food created rich memories. It filled more than my stomach. It filled hearts. And even if no one misses the taste of powdered milk, many still long for the feeling of sitting at that table, surrounded by family, knowing that somehow, someway, everything was going to be all right. Which of these foods do you remember most? Share your 1970s grocery memories below.